everyone, and welcome to our event today. This lecture is being held in honor of Professor Emmanuel Q. Fernando, a distinguished philosopher, legal scholar, and former chairperson of our department at UP Diliman, remembered for his rigorous intellect and dedication to the analytic tradition of philosophy. Ma'am Zosa, how has your day been so far?
Hello, everyone, and thank you for asking, Colleen. It's been a really nice day so far. I'm thrilled to see how everything will turn out today. How are you feeling about the coming lecture and our guest speakers?
I'm feeling very excited about it. I think today's topic is not only timely, but also something that will leave us all with a lot to think about. I've been eager to hear our speakers' insights, and I know everyone here will gain something valuable from it.
Yeah, absolutely. This lecture will surely challenge some of our assumptions, spark new ideas, and hopefully inspire us to take what we learn and put them into action.
So, without further ado, let's get into our program. Hello, everyone, and on behalf of the UP Diliman Department of Philosophy, I would like to warmly welcome all of you to our event today. I'd also like to extend a special welcome to our speakers who have joined us today. While I won't be giving full introductions just yet, please join me in expressing our appreciation for their time and expertise. We look forward to a very insightful and engaging discussion on one of the world's most urgent ethical conversations, animal ethics. Having been previously hidden from the public's eye, many issues are now coming to light, and with them come new ethical concerns. We live in a world where old norms are being questioned and new ethical frameworks are emerging. Whether we come to these conversations as philosophers, activists, scientists, or simply as people trying to live responsibly, we all share our faith in the outcome of the answers we hope to find today.
Okay, at this time, we would first like to take a brief pause to remember our dearly beloved friend and colleague, Professor Earl Stanley Fronda, who passed away exactly 1 year ago on this day. A passionate philosopher of language and religion, he is sorely missed in our department. Let us take a moment of silence to commemorate his life and achievements. Now, we would like to transition to Professor Enrique Benjamin Henry Fernando III to give his opening remarks on behalf of our Department of Philosophy Chairperson, Professor Maria Liza Ruth Ocampo. Professor Fernando is the brains and main organizer behind our lecture today. Now, everyone, join us in listening to Professor Fernando as he welcomes us with a few words on behalf of the Department of Philosophy.
Okay, thank you very much, Marielle. I will keep this to a few words, just as you said. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It is our absolute pleasure to welcome all of you to another one of our lectures. Currently, I see that there are 463 people in attendance. That is the highest number we've had so far, actually, in our lecture. This is also the lecture which has seen the highest number of registrations thus far. I think we're close to 1,500. So we're very grateful that the number of attendees to our events keeps growing, and we hope to welcome you to future events. And it's very fitting that we have a very good number of audience members today, because Peter Singer, I think, is the most influential living philosopher in the world, with massive contributions not just to philosophy, but to actual organizations around the world that make a difference. We often think of philosophy as being a purely conceptual or theoretical discipline, which oftentimes may or may not translate into concrete actions. Peter Singer is a prime example of someone who walks the talk and practices what he preaches and actually uses his philosophy to make a difference in the world today. Thank you once again for attending. We can't wait to hear from Professor Singer. Thank you very much for joining us today. And we can't wait to hear from the audience as well when we have our question and answer portion. So please enjoy our event, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you, Professor Fernando, for those welcoming words and for all you do for the department. It is because of your initiative and Professor Campus leadership that we are able to host such events today. Thank you once again for all your time and support. Before we begin our awaited lecture, may we call on Ms. Julia Naval to give a brief introduction for our speaker today.
As we begin today's lecture, we would like to introduce one of the most prominent philosophers of today's generation and renowned animal rights champion, Professor Peter Singer. Peter Singer was born in Melbourne, Australia in 1946 and has taught at Oxford, Monash University, and Princeton University. He first became well known internationally after the publication of Animal Liberation in 1975. A fully revised and updated version, Animal Liberation Now, was published in 2023. His book, The Life You Can Save, led him to co-found the organization of the same name, which has raised more than $100 million to assist people in extreme poverty. Singer's other books include Practical Ethics, The Most Good You Can Do, The Point of View of the Universe, and most recently, The Buddhist and the Ethicist. In 2021, Singer was awarded $1 million Berggruen Prize for Philosophy and Culture. He donated the prize money to effective charities working to reduce suffering, both for humans and for animals. Since retiring from Princeton last year, he has co-hosted the podcast Lives Well Lived with Kasia de Lazari Radek. Without further ado, we welcome with resounding applause Professor Peter Singer.
Thank you very much. It's my great pleasure to be able to speak to this large audience, to speak to people in the Philippines, which I'm sure I've had some people from the Philippines in my audiences, but I haven't spoken previously at a lecture organized by an organization or a department in the Philippines. So I'm really happy to be able to do that. I do have what I believe is a very important topic, and it's a topic that I hope that you will all be thinking about and think about its relevance to you and to the way that you are living. So I'm going to share my screen to start. I hope you can see my screen now. Yes, looks like you can. So, as I say, I'm going to talk about animal liberation, past, present, and future, because I have been involved in this issue for really almost all of my academic career from the time when I was a graduate student. And so I followed it, and I think it's been positive, but there is still a lot of work to be done. And that's the kind of thing that I do want to talk about. So, let me start with the past then. Let's go back. And I want to go back, in fact, exactly 50 years ago, because 50 years ago, this book was published. In fact, even in this month, it was published in September in the United States edition, Animal Liberation, A New Treatment for Animals. And I want to tell you about the arguments that I developed in that book, and also, as I say, what's been happening since that time. So let's go back to 1975 and ask, what was the position that people generally accepted with regard to animals? What was the standard ethical view? Well, I think most people, certainly in the countries that I'm most familiar with, I'm Australian by birth. I've taught in I did graduate work in the United Kingdom, and I've taught in the United States, so that's where I've spent most of my time. But I think generally in most societies, there was a view that we ought to be kind to animals. Kindness to animals is regarded as a good thing. And what I call wanton cruelty was regarded as a bad thing. So by wanton cruelty, I mean cruelty, if you like, just for the fun of it, or just for the heck of it, for no particular other purpose. So in other words, somebody picking up a stick and hitting a dog, or kicking a dog who is lying sleeping on a footpath, or even maybe deliberately, say, setting fire to a cat, let's say. I think generally that was regarded as the wrong thing to do. But on the other hand, the view was that our interests override the interests of non-human animals. So while you shouldn't be cruel to them for no reason, if there is some reason, then you can override their interests. So that's an important limit to the opposition we had to cruelty. And it's also true, and I think it's an interesting difference perhaps today, that animal welfare was seen as a cause mainly for conservatives, and it was viewed then by people who were more progressive politically as a distraction from more serious issues. So it was not considered a radical cause at all 50 years ago. And as for the idea that animals might have rights, nobody really took that seriously 50 years ago. It was literally ridiculed when people did start to mention it at first. And what about the major issues which I am going to talk about today? So in particular, let's talk about factory farming. What you're seeing on the screen here is how the overwhelming majority of chickens raised for meat are produced throughout the world today. Certainly there are some people, particularly in rural areas, who do raise chickens able to run around outside. But certainly in the United States, it's over 99%. It's quite close to 100% of chickens that are eaten are reared like this, as you see, in a huge shed and in extremely crowded conditions. As I say here, animal welfare organizations in 1975 did not mention this animal welfare problem. And I did not know about it myself until 1970, when I was 24 years old. And it's not that I was poorly educated. On the contrary, I had already a Bachelor of Arts and a Master's of Arts from the University of Melbourne, and I had been gone to Oxford University to do graduate work. But I did not know that animals were reared inside in very crowded conditions like this. As for the alternative, which is to not eat any animal foods, what we now know as being vegan, that term was essentially unknown in 1970. If you would talk to somebody about following a vegan diet, they probably would have looked at you blankly and asked, "What does that mean?" And if you'd explain to them what it means, they might well have doubted whether you could even survive without eating animal products. That was quite a common belief. And as most people had never met anybody who was vegan, it was a belief that was fairly widely shared. Okay, there were also no conferences at universities about issues relating to animals. And I thought I would show you this photo, which was the first conference that I believe was held by any academic institution about ethics in animals. And it was held in 1979 in Blacksburg, Virginia. And I was fortunate enough, sorry, I lost that. Oops, let's go back. Sorry. I was fortunate enough to be able to attend. That's me with a big bushy moustache and a lot more hair than I have today, on the left of the photo. And this is quite a well-known group of people who all had an impact. Next to me is Tom Regan, who wrote a book called The Case for Animal Rights, published a couple of years after Animal Liberation. In the middle is James Rachels, a philosopher who wrote a book called Created from Animals, which is a line from Darwin. Charles Darwin said, many people believe that we needed a divine creation, but Darwin says it's more reasonable to believe that we were created from animals. Then in the colourful jacket is Stephen Clarke, a philosopher in England. And on the right-hand side, excuse me, is Henry Spira, who I'm going to talk about a little bit, mentioned. Not a philosopher, but a campaigner for animals. Unfortunately, of this group, only I and Stephen Clarke are still alive. Okay, let's move to what is the central ethical argument of animal liberation. And if there's one thing that I want you to take away from this talk and think about, maybe discuss with friends, this is what I think is most important. And I want to start with the concept of speciesism. This is not a word that I invented. I came across it in a little leaflet handed out by a man called Richard Ryder, who was, I was in Oxford at the time, and Richard Ryder was also living and working in Oxford. But I suppose that you could say that I popularized that term because I used it in animal liberation, and it became fairly widely known and it's been in the Oxford English Dictionary for quite a few years. The point of the term, of course, is to make a parallel between the way that racists, particularly I'm thinking of the most extreme racists, for example, those who owned slaves or took part in the slave trade, were racists in that way. And also, to some extent, sexism or male dominance over women. I think that there's an important parallel or analogy between the way we treat animals and the way the slave owners and slave traders treated Africans, and to some extent the way in which historically men have very often treated women. Now, the parallel is not exact, no analogy is exact, but I think it's still instructive. And why do I think that it's an important instructive parallel? Well, in all of these cases, what we have is a dominant group, a group that is more powerful for one reason or other than the others. In the case of racism, Europeans, white people, were more powerful because they had advanced technology. They had guns, for example, which Africans did not have at the time of the slave trade. And in the case of men and women, men were physically stronger, and that gave them power. And in both cases, they exploited or used the less powerful group in a way that was in their own interests, or at least they believed it to be in their own interests, but was clearly very contrary, very harmful to the interests of the less powerful group they were using. And if we look at human relations with animals, both throughout history and still today, I think we can see something very similar. Again, we are more powerful because of our advanced technology. Obviously, if we were talking about muscle power, there are some animals that are much stronger than us, but because of the technology that we have, that doesn't enable them to gain power over us on the whole. On the contrary, we have a lot of power over them. And we use them, again, in our interests. We use them in ways that are somewhat similar, I would say more similar to the way that slave owners used slaves than to the way that men used women, because typically men had more feelings for women and some regard for them, and at least some women they cared for genuinely and would not want to harm. But in the case of our treatment of animals, like the case of the slave traders and slaves, they didn't really give the interests of the less powerful group much weight. They allowed their own interests to override them in virtually all circumstances. And so just as the slave traders captured animals and transported them across the seas in ways that led to many of them dying. So we have captured animals, we have domesticated and bred them, and we transport them still today, sometimes over the seas. My own country, Australia, is still shipping animals from Australia to the Middle East, for example, although fortunately that the government is ending that terrible trade. But also we transport them around the world and around the country in very bad conditions, and we kill them for our own interests without much regard for their interests. So that's why I think to say that we have speciesist attitudes to animals is justified, and I think that it is also something that cannot be defended, just as racism and sexism cannot be defended. So let's look at the history of speciesism briefly, because it has been going for a long time. And we see it actually in some of the writings of otherwise respected philosophers and thinkers. We see it perhaps clearly in the book of Genesis, in the Hebrew scriptures and what's become the Christian Bible. And we have this verse where sometimes known as the dominion verse, because it says that God gives us the right to have dominion over the animals, over the fish of the sea and the fowl of the air, and over the earth and over every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth. So this is a justification, clearly, for our dominion over the animals. And that's one strain of Western thought, obviously. It was very influential. But then we also have roots, philosophical roots, in the thinking of the ancient Greeks. And Aristotle also took the view that animals and also plants exist for the sake of man, as he says. So he had a view in which things exist in the universe for a purpose, and the purpose of animals is to enable humans to eat them, to use their furs or skins for fur or leather. And basically, they're there for our ends, not for their own ends. Of course, Aristotle knew nothing about Darwin or the theory of evolution. We now know that that is not the case, that animals simply evolved and we evolved from other animals. And there is no purpose in that process. It is just something that happened. So I think we can clearly say Aristotle was wrong, but he did have a very lasting influence on Western thought. And here's a man who brought his influence into Western thought, and specifically into Christian thought. This is Thomas Aquinas, perhaps the most influential of the Christian theologians and thinkers over history, certainly of the medieval ones. He lived in the 13th century, and he was a Christian, but he actually knew Aristotle. Aristotle was the only philosopher who was read in Europe at that time. Aristotle, whoops, sorry, I've done the wrong thing again. Aristotle's works have been preserved through Arabic culture, actually, through Islamic thinkers in North Africa, and then brought to Europe. And so Aquinas was both influenced by the dominion verse. You see here, he says, God has subjected all things to man's power. That's clearly a reference to the verse from Genesis that I gave you a little while ago. And he also read Aristotle, and so he thought that there was a harmony, that they both agreed that we're entitled to use animals. And so he actually has this strong view, which, as I said at the beginning, I don't think many people would accept today, that it just doesn't matter how we behave to animals because of the dominion verse. As I said, most people today would think, well, it does matter in the sense that just being cruel to an animal for the sake of it is wrong. But Aquinas did not think that this was wrong, or at least not that it was a wrong to the animal. He thought well, if you're cruel to animals, maybe you'll be cruel to humans as well, and that would be bad. So it's better not to be cruel to animals for the sake of humans, not for the sake of animals. And no doubt it is true that if you practice cruelty to animals, you may be more cruel to humans. But obviously, what I'm arguing is that it's the pain and suffering of the animals that is the primary reason for that, not that perhaps it will have bad consequences for humans as well. Okay, and then if we come to the 18th century, we have the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who also thought that we have no direct duties to animals. His reason was that they're not self-conscious, he said. They're there merely as a means to an end, and that end is man. So it's, again, a very consistent view going through Western philosophy for really almost, well, going back to Aristotle, more than 2,000 years. And I think the most important break from that tradition came only at the end of the 18th century from Jeremy Bentham, who was a contemporary of Kant in that their lives overlapped. And he may have read Kant, and it may be that in this quote he's thinking of Kant when he says, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but can they suffer? Bentham was a great reformer, a reforming utilitarian, reforming things to reduce human suffering, for example, reforming the terrible prisons that existed in his day, but he was also concerned about the interests of animals. Now, the standard reply to this remark of Bentham's, the question is not can they talk or can they reason, but can they suffer? The standard reply is to say, well, humans are different. This is like what Kant said, and there are various differences. So there's a sentence that could begin, but only humans are, and then we can fill it in, only humans are rational, only humans are self-aware, only humans are autonomous, can direct their own lives, only humans are moral agents, only humans use language. So there are many differences here. But the question is, are they relevant differences when it comes to how bad suffering is? Oh, and only humans are able to take part in a social contract, some contract philosophers have said. And I would argue that, in fact, while these differences might be important in many respects, they don't reduce how bad it is for a being to suffer. If a being is conscious, then a being can suffer, and you can certainly be conscious without being any of these things. I'm not saying that animals are not some of these things. I think clearly animals are to varying degrees, and different species of animals to higher degrees, rational, self-aware, autonomous, maybe even moral agents, may be able to use language to some extent or to communicate in various ways. But even if they're not, if they can feel pain, that pain is bad. And Bentham himself had a response to this argument that only humans have these qualities. And this is the response. He asked, what else is it that should trace the insuperable line? And by the insuperable line, he meant the line between a being whose interests matter and whom we should not inflict suffering on unless there's an absolutely overridingly important reason for doing so. You could say by the insuperable line, Bentham means a being with rights rather than a being lacking rights. And Bentham asks, as I say, is it the faculty of reason or perhaps the faculty of discourse? In other words, being able to talk. But he says, a full-grown horse or dog is beyond comparison a more rational as well as a more conversable animal than an infant of a day or a week or even a month old. And that's certainly true. If you've had children, as I have, or if you've had a baby brother or sister perhaps in your family, or you've just spent time with very young children, you will know, and of course, if you spend a little bit of time with a horse or a dog, you will know that you can communicate more with a horse or a dog and they are more aware of the world and more able to make rational choices than a newborn baby. So if you think that unless you have these characteristics, you don't have rights or your suffering doesn't matter, then you have to answer the question, well, why does the suffering of a newborn baby matter? Why would it be wrong to inflict pain on a newborn baby? And I think it obviously would be. Okay, so if that's right, if what I'm arguing so far is right, what is the principle that we should use to relate to animals? What is a non-speciesist principle, one that is not open to the moral objection that you have a bias in favor of your own species, just as racists and sexists have biases in favor of their own race or sex? And here's a principle that I think is impartial, that doesn't have a bias. It's the principle of equal consideration of similar interests. It says we ought to give equal weight to similar beings, similar interests, irrespective of the species of the being whose interests they are. So I'm talking here about similar interests. The interests of humans and non-human animals will sometimes differ, just as the interests of different humans will differ. But where we have similar interests, for example, similar capacity to feel pain or to feel some types of pain, physical pain, and the pain is likely to be just as bad, we should give equal weight to preventing the pain of a non-human animal or a human. So that if the pain of the non-human animal is greater than the pain of the human, we should give priority to stopping that pain. That's the principle of equal consideration of similar interests. Okay, so that's the central argument, as I said, that I wanted to put to you, and I hope has given you something to think about. Let me now have a look at the progress that has been made over those 50 years since Animal Liberation was published. Because there has been progress, even though, as I say, and as we'll see, there is still a long way to go. So here's some progress that was made by Pope Francis just 10 years ago. That view that Aquinas put forward in the 13th century has finally been rejected, officially rejected by the head of the Roman Catholic Church. As I said, I think it was still the dominant view right up into the 20th century, into the early 20th century anyway. You can certainly find it written in many works of the Catholic Church, that God has given us dominion over the animals, and therefore we're entitled to treat them as we wish. But gradually in the 20th century, it became less widely used, less widely referred to. I think many people in the Catholic Church became uncomfortable with that idea. And here Pope Francis admits that it has at times been incorrectly interpreted. And so he says, nowadays we must forcefully reject the notion that our being created in God's image and given dominion over the earth justifies absolute dominion over other creatures. So that's a significant step forward in thinking for the Catholic Church, and I welcome that. Now, in talking about the progress that's been made, there are a lot of different areas that I could discuss, a lot of different ways in which we use and abuse animals. But I want to focus on what is by far the biggest issue, and that is food, the way we raise animals for food. Because if you look at the numbers, so one other large area of animal abuse that you might think about, particularly if you have been doing biology courses, is the use of animals in research. And although it's hard to get accurate figures, a reasonable estimate might be that about 200 million animals are used in experiments each year worldwide, and nearly all of them end up dying, and quite a lot of them suffer significant pain in that process. So 200 million is not a small number, it is significant. But now compare that with the issue of using animals for food. The number, just focusing on vertebrate animals, because I think we can be highly confident that all vertebrates are capable of feeling pain and suffering, it's approximately 200 billion. So it's about 1,000 times more. For every animal used in research, about 1,000 animals are raised and killed for food worldwide. So that's why I'm focusing on this issue. It's the most important, I think, in the way that humans treat animals. And I'm not including here wild-caught fish. I'm talking about animals that humans raise. So that does include fish when they're fish farmed, factory farmed underwater, it is really, but it doesn't include the wild-caught fish. The number would be much, much larger if you include all the wild-caught fish. Okay, so what are some of the things that have been achieved? Well, in 1975, this was a standard method of raising veal calves in industrialized countries in the entire European Union, including the United Kingdom, and in the United States and some other countries as well. The calves were kept in these very narrow stalls. They were unable to turn around, even. The stalls are too narrow for them to turn around. They were separated from their mothers within hours of birth, and they were fed on a kind of milk replacement. This is in order to keep the meat from these calves very soft, very pale. The producers got a higher price for veal that was pale pink rather than red. And so the calves had to be kept away from grass because grass contains iron. And if they started to eat grass, their flesh would go red rather than pink. So that's one of the main reasons why they were brought inside and put into these stalls. Now, raising veal calves in individual stalls like this is now illegal in the European Union and in the United Kingdom. And it's no longer being used. It's not illegal everywhere in the United States, but it's generally not being used in the United States. This is how pigs are reared, again, in industrialized countries. These are the breeding sows. So these are not the pigs sent to market for bacon or ham or pork particularly, but their mothers. And they are confined again in these very narrow stalls, too narrow for them to turn around. You can see that one of the sows can't even get her legs comfortable without sticking them through the bars of the neighbor. Note the metal slats on the floor. There's no straw, there's no bedding, there's nothing for the comfort of the pigs. And incidentally, pigs are forest animals, as you may know, and if they live in a forest, they will actually make themselves a kind of a bed of leaves or other soft things to lie on. But that costs money, the straw costs money, the labor to give clean straw and to clean out the straw costs money. It's cheaper to have these metal slats. Then you just hose down the manure, it falls through the slats and gets carried away. So never mind that the pig is less comfortable, never mind that the pig is totally bored, of course, living in these stalls all through their pregnancy, the vast majority of their lives, caged like this. That doesn't matter. If this is the cheapest and most efficient way to produce more piglets, that's what's going to happen. And here it is on a larger scale. This is a Chinese piggery. It's actually a multi-story piggery. So this is just one floor of it. And you can see the vast number of sows also kept in these individual stalls, unable to really turn around, just receding into the distance of the photo. These are the pigs that do get sold to market. Have some company, I suppose. They can turn around a little bit, but they're also very closely confined, and they're also typically never going outside. They're reared indoors for their entire lives. This is intensive egg production. Again, this is the vast majority of eggs produced for urban city dwellers. They come from hens kept in small wire cages like this. These cages, as you can see, are pretty filthy. There's the droppings from the top row just fall down on the roof of the row below. The floor is sloped, so the eggs will roll to the front and can more easily be collected. And the hens are very, very crowded in these wire cages. They can't even stretch their wings fully in their cages. And that's the way they live for essentially pretty much their entire life. For a year or so, once they're old enough to start laying eggs, they're put in these cages and they only come out of it when their rate of laying drops away and they're taken out to be killed. That's another shot, more of a close-up. This system, again, I should say, has been banned in many places, but it's also still in use in many places, including in many places in the United States. This is, again, a Chinese example. It's certainly a lot cleaner than the other one, but the caging is still very, very crowded and there's very little room to move around. And again, being in China, it's all on a huge scale. And this is the slide that I showed you before of chicken production. And here's a quote from Professor John Webster, who's a veterinarian and the founder of a Centre for the Study of the Welfare of Farmed Animals at the University of Bristol in England. And he has described this as the single most severe systematic example of men's inhumanity to another sentient animal. Now, you might ask, why is this so bad? Well, obviously, the birds are very crowded. Still, you might say, at least they can move, they can turn around, they can stretch their wings, which some of the other shots I showed you, the animals cannot do. But what you don't see here is that these birds have been bred to grow extremely fast and to put on weight extremely fast. And what Webster's research established is that their leg bones are not mature enough to hold their weight. These birds are killed very young. If you eat chicken, the bird you're eating would have been about 6 or at the most 7 weeks old when it was killed. And yet it's as big as a bird that 50 years ago would have had to be like 12 weeks or 15 weeks old. And the 6 or 7 week old birds, their legs are not really going to be able to bear their weight very well. And so Webster has said that they are actually suffering pain from simply the problems with standing up when they are bred to grow so fast. Milk production has also increasingly become intensive. This is an intensive dairy where the cows don't really go outside. They're also confined and fed on hay. And one thing about the dairy industry is that cows, like humans, will only give milk after they have given birth. So each year the cows are made pregnant, and each year their calf is taken away from them immediately after birth. If the calf is a female, she may be raised as a dairy cow. If the calf is a male, he will be maybe slaughtered immediately for veal or maybe reared for a low quality meat. As they're dairy calves, they're not the variety of cow that is given that yields high price meat. But there's a lot of suffering in the separation of the calf and mothers because they're mammals, and the bond between the cow and her calf is a very strong one. And the cow will call out for the calf often for hours or even days after the calf is removed. And then there's fish production, which is also incredibly intensive, very crowded, no real consideration given for the welfare of the fish either. Okay, so those are areas that we still need to make progress on. I just want to come back to one other area of progress, and that is that over the last 50 years, science has advanced quite a lot about understanding animal consciousness. And I think we have a more positive picture of animal intelligence, animal awareness, and animal thought. And I'm showing you this image because I'm amused by it, and also because I'm an Australian. And what you're seeing here is a sulphur-crested cockatoo. That's an Australian kind of parrot. And this parrot is opening a bin. These are the kind of trash cans that a few years ago started being used for Australians, suburban or urban Australians, to put out their trash. Notice that the bird is opening a bin with a red lid. It's the red lids where the food waste goes into. The yellow lids next to it are recycling birds. But it's been documented, it was documented in Sydney first, that a little while after these bins started to be used, cockatoos learnt to open them. And it's not easy because that's quite a heavy lid. And the bird has to get the lid at the corner in its beak to raise it up to that 45-degree angle that it's at there. And then the bird has to walk along the edge of the bin so that the lid eventually falls over the other side, as they do when you open them. And then, of course, the bird can enjoy any food scraps that are in there. But this is a learnt behavior, obviously. It didn't evolve. It's only a few years old. And the scientists who started studying it noticed that they would have a report in a particular spot where the bins were being opened and the cockatoos were getting at them. And then they could draw circles around that spot as to when birds were doing it there. So obviously it spreads by observation, by some cockatoos watching other cockatoos doing this and then learning to do it and doing it themselves. Okay, perhaps a bigger issue though, rather than the intelligence of cockatoos, is the suffering of fish, because fish are a very large part of those 200 million animals, the vertebrate animals that I said that are raised and killed for food. Chickens and fish are the most common species that are raised for food. Fish, of course, not a species, it's a whole huge number of species. And some people doubted that fish can feel pain, but there has been some good research done on that. There's this book, Do Fish Feel Pain, by Victoria Braithwaite, an American scientist, and a statement from Lynn Snedden, who is another scientist who has studied fish pain. And as she says, the science has spoken, fish feel pain much like we do. We must do more to protect these sensitive creatures. So I think it's clearly been established over those 50 years in a way that it wasn't before, that fish are capable of feeling pain. And also, there's been interesting research on some invertebrates, particularly the octopus. Some of you may have seen a film that came out a few years ago called My Octopus Teacher. But octopus are clearly intelligent, problem-solving beings. And this is a report done at the London School of Economics by a combined team of philosophers and scientists, reviewing the evidence for the capacity to feel pain in cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans. Basically, that means octopus, squid, crabs, and lobsters. So I think it's now regarded as at least very probable that they can all feel pain. As I said, sorry, I've just said what's on this slide. And the United Kingdom is sufficiently convinced by this to have included them as sentient beings in recent legislation. And the European Union also has rules now protecting animals used in research. Okay, I need to move so that you have some time for questions. Let's look at what's happened more recently. One of the big issues that's happening more recently, of course, is the development of artificial intelligence. And it's important for the future as to whether artificial intelligence is going to take the interests of non-human animals into consideration. Because already artificial intelligence is being used in some factory farms in regulating the conditions for animals. Artificial intelligence is also used in self-driving cars, the semi-autonomous cars that we have now, and will increasingly be used, I guess, in fully autonomous cars. And they also have to make decisions about animals on the road. Should they stop for an animal on the road? Should they try to swerve to the side? How much weight do they give to the interests of animals? So developing artificial intelligence in ways that takes the interests of animals seriously is a new area of ethics for animals. But I think, and I'm actually closing with this slide, I think the most important thing that we ought to be doing at this stage is focusing on factory farming for a number of reasons, not all of them concerned with animals, but it does involve, as I said earlier, a vast amount of suffering for animals, more than any other human activity, I would say, regarding animals. But in addition, actually, although people may say factory farming is necessary to feed the world's growing population, that is the opposite of the truth. Factory farming reduces the amount of food available to humans because when we confine animals indoors, we have to grow food to feed to them. And simply in order to live, in order to keep their bodies warm, these are overwhelmingly birds and mammals, warm-blooded animals, they burn up a lot of the food value that we feed to them. Other parts of it are used to make their bones or their skin, parts we don't eat. And so the net effect is to actually quite drastically reduce the amount of food available to humans by feeding our grain and soybeans to factory farmed animals. Also, I don't have time to go into the climate change problem, but I'm sure you're aware of it. Factory farming increases greenhouse gas emissions. It increases the risk of another pandemic because pandemics come from animals. And the pandemic prior to COVID-19 was a swine flu pandemic, which came out of intensive pig farms. You only have to look at them to see that they are ideal environments for spreading viruses among animals whose health is not always good, whose immune system may be weakened by the stress of the confinement. And you have then thousands of animals in a shed, so viruses can easily spread among them. And you have humans going into the shed to clean things or to move the animals out when it's time for them to be slaughtered. So we're definitely increasing the risk of pandemics by having factory farms. So if I've persuaded you that there is something wrong about what we're doing to animals, I would say your primary goal should be to try to end factory farming. And of course, you can all contribute to at least reducing factory farming by not eating its products. And I advocate not eating animal products at all because it's very hard to know whether the animals have been treated well. And certainly for meat, they all get slaughtered at a young age. So I think it's best to try to avoid animal products. That goes back to the slide about being vegan. You can live a long and healthy life as a vegan and certainly also as a vegetarian. So I think spreading those ways of eating, moving to plant-based diets, is also a very positive thing to do for animals and for the world. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Singer, for your time and joining us today to engage in meaningful dialogue surrounding these critical issues pending in our world today. Your insights have brought us one step closer to finding the answers our world needs. At this juncture, let's call on stage Miss Rachel Estanislao to introduce one of our very own distinguished faculty to give a commentary.
Our next speaker, Professor Janat Eliasol Naval, brings not only a wealth of academic insight, but also a powerful ethical voice to today's conversation. A professor and former chair of the Department of Philosophy at the University of the Philippines, Diliman, she has also served as Assistant Vice President for Public Affairs and now chairs the Technical Panel for Philosophy at the Commission on Higher Education. Her research spans ancient and applied philosophy with particular focus on environmental and agricultural ethics, animal ethics, the philosophy of food, indigenous environmental philosophy, Filosofiyang Filipino, and ecotech gender studies exploring the intersections of ecology, technology, and gender. Through her published work on ethical farming and Audio Leopold's land ethic, Professor Yasol Naval challenges us to think critically and feel deeply about the lives and ecosystems we often overlook. Today, she invites us to re-examine our relationship with the natural world and the moral responsibilities that come with it. Please join me in welcoming Professor Janet Yasol Naval.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Professor Peter Singer, for gracing our forum this afternoon and for your interesting lecture on animal liberation, past, present, and future. Looking back, my engagement with animal liberation, the book, has been something of a personal journey. I first encountered the book in the late 1980s and early 1990s, more than a decade after its publication in 1975, just as I was starting my MA studies. It quickly became a topic of lively conversation, discussions with some of my senior colleagues then, now long retired, including Assistant Professor Enrique Henry Fernando's uncle, the late Professor Emmanuel Fernando, Professor Jerry De Villa, and of course, the late Professor Leo De Castro, who would later become my supervisor and advisor in my MA thesis on the value of animals, and who will later on invite me to co-author a short article titled Fritz Jahr's Bioethic and Respect for Animals and Ecology in the Philippines, and also the translation of his first article on bioethics in 1926, Fritz Jahr's Life Sciences and the Teaching of Ethics. Later, at around the year 2000, I acquired my first personal, though second-hand copy of your Animal Liberation from Strand Bookstore. Unfortunately, that copy was destroyed in the Faculty Center fire, which we had in 2016. But I was then fortunate to obtain the 40th anniversary edition of Animal Liberation, published in 2015, which I secured after attending your plenary talk on animal liberation at the World Congress of Philosophy in China in 2018. So fast forward to today, when you kindly granted the department's request for this lecture, I felt it only fitting to acquire a copy of Animal Liberation Now, which I did thanks to, well, Amazon and a recent trip. So from the early stories of stolen videos exposing cruel experiments on rabbits and chimpanzees to haunting images of cattle confined in 18-inch stalls and chickens that see daylight only on the day that they are slaughtered and hung on conveyor belts, the ones that you showed us, animals used in sports and recreation, and even the radical opposition of PETA, People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals. In the first edition of the Animal Liberation in 1975, the Animal Liberation Now shifts to scrutinize this time how global animal welfare reforms have progressed, as also shown in your presentation, while at the same time they're undermined by a staggering surge of factory farming, particularly driven by China, which I first heard from you in the Beijing conference. I find that one of the most interesting updates is on how Animal Liberation Now sharpens the environmental dimension of meat consumption and how it presents a toll on climate change and public health concerns in relation to the COVID-19 pandemic. Professor Singer raises a chilling epidemiological warning on how industrial-scale animal agriculture could amplify the risk of zoonotic pandemics. Hence, what is underscored is that the moral imperative to protect animals actually extends into the realm of global health and, of course, environmental survival. This recalls a paper I shared during the pandemic titled Why Vaccine is Not a Sustainable Response Measure for the Pandemic. COVID-19 opened critical discussions on wildlife trafficking and its connection to the wildlife food industry, particularly in China, which created the perfect conditions for the emergence, for the concoction of a zoonotic disease. This perspective I guess, resonates with the current and emerging One Health program, which underscores a pragmatic interdependence on human well-being, which depends on the sound health condition of animals and the ecosystems. Yet, while this approach represents an important step forward, it often values animal health primarily in terms of its consequences for humans. I find it compelling that while Professor Singer's rejection of speciesism resonates with the One Health principle, it also departs from it significantly. Animal liberation, now I see, provides a philosophical foundation for a more robust moral vision. For it is argued that the suffering of sentient beings possess, moral weight worthy of equal consideration of similar interests. For One Health, this would imply moving beyond a human-centered biosecurity framework toward an ethic of shared vulnerability in which preventing disease outbreaks in livestock, for example, is not justified solely by human safety, but equally by the animal's own interests. When animal liberation is discussed in my classes, students oftentimes ask, is Singer a vegan? So are you Professor Singer? But I think we heard it from him. In some interviews and in the work Why Vegan Eating Ethically, I think this has been raised, and the concept also of flexible veganism was introduced and was mentioned. Well, I would like to say something in this regard. Applying the idea of veganism in the Philippines has prompted significant discussion in my classes. It was observed how flexible veganism intersects with a distinct set of challenges. In the country, food security is shaped and affected by poverty, climate vulnerability, and dependence on global markets. For many of our rural communities here, small-scale animal husbandry or backyard animal husbandry and fishing for coastal communities, lots of them, are integral to both their subsistence and cultural life. Interestingly, Amartya Sen's entitlement approach appears, particularly relevant here, as he also argues that famine and hunger are rarely caused by absolute food shortages, but by failures in access, distribution, and entitlement rights. Applying this to veganism may suggest that the ethical problem may not primarily be dietary preference, but the structural inequities that limit people's ability to choose. Without addressing poverty and food distribution, maybe prescribing veganism in the global south, including the Philippines, may have risks of becoming, morally insensitive. Furthermore, in the Philippines, communities often define their food systems, our food systems, through ecological sustainability and cultural traditions. This means that Filipinos may prioritize resilient local practices, particularly in farming and food production, which shape our patterns of consumption. A vegan or flexible vegan model, however, may somehow risk sidelining indigenous practices that, while not strictly vegan, are nevertheless less exploitative of animals and more ecologically attuned. For example, many of our rural households in the Philippines practice integrated farming, like planting root crops, cassava, for example, vegetables, coconut, and raising a few chickens, goats, and pigs alongside. The animals often eat food scraps or forage naturally, and their manure fertilizes the soil. This creates a relatively low input circular system that sustains food security for the families. By contrast, a Western vegan alternative might suggest replacing eggs, for example, or milk from these systems with important plant-based substitutes, soy milk, almond milk, name it. While vegan in form, these products may be are actually industrial produced, resource intensive, and often imported, making our communities maybe more dependent on global agribusiness supply chains. This, therefore, could risk overlooking local, resilient, and ecologically embedded food practices that include some animal use, but avoid the systemic cruelty of avoids the systemic cruelty of factory farming, as you were saying. When veganism is placed in a dialogue within the Philippine context, maybe what is needed is a contextual ethics of food that aligns animal liberation with human dignity, whatever may be important to the people, and ecological resilience. I mean, in relation to the culture. So ultimately, I could not help, of course, but agree that animal liberation now, both a plea for moral recognition and a warning that animal suffering is inseparable from humanity's greatest crisis. Industrial farming drives climate change, yes, biodiversity loss, pandemic risk, making the fate of animals bound up with our own survival. But for vulnerable nations like the Philippines, the challenge is quite clear: to imagine food systems maybe that honor humans, animals, and the planet all alike. Whether we act with conviction or settle for half measures will determine, I guess, not only the future of animals, but also the resilience of our species in a fragile world. The real question then remains and is whether we are willing to expand the circle of our moral concern, our moral community, as to live as if animal suffering, as if their suffering, truly matters. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Professor Yasol Naval, for your critical insights on this topic today, as these relate to our indigenous Philippine context. You have been and continue to be a wonderful guiding figure on applied ethics here at UP Diliman, especially for the Department of Philosophy. At this time, we would like to transition to Professor Simon de Guzman Daulat as we open up the floor to a Q&A session with our guests. Please wait to be called if you want to ask a question for any of our speakers. Once called, kindly open your camera, and Professor de Guzman Daulat will attend to and assist you shortly. Professor Simon, please take it away.
Thank you very much, Professor Zosa. Now, as mentioned, please raise your hand if you have any questions, and we would like to limit asking one question per person to give more chance to others. Our first question will be from Mr. Ron Imperial. So, please open your camera if you can and unmute yourself.
Can I be heard?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Good day. Thank you for your lecture. I am Ron Joshua Imperial, an MA student, MA philosophy student from UP Diliman. I have one question, and I ask this in view of Cora Diamond's critique of your fundamental suppositions in your right-based and consequentialist animal ethics. So more on the meta-ethical level. By the way, Diamond, for those who don't know, is also a vegetarian, and she supports animal welfare, but in a different sense. My question is quite lengthy, but please bear with me. In her article, "Eating Meat and Eating People," which I think is one of the most famous and robust criticisms of your animal ethics and of Tom Regan, Diamond argues that the way we should morally think about animals is not based, primarily at least, on recognizing animal interests, and the way and their capacity to feel pain and pleasure equal to those of humans. Rather, she argues that we should begin our, rec- our we should begin by recognizing our relationship with them. For example, in non-human animal ethics, it would be insufficient to say that the Nazis should consider the best and the capacity of suffering of the Jews, or to say that the Israelis should consider the interest and capacity to feel pain of the Palestinians, when, to begin with, the Nazis' relation to the Jews and the Israelis to the Palestinians make such recognition impossible. In fact, it's also possible to recognize the capacity to suffer of others and yet use such recognition to treat others viciously. The IDF, for example, may well know that Palestinians can suffer, and yet precisely use that as a motivation to hurt Palestinians because they do not have a well humane relations with them. The same goes for animals. We must, according to Diamond, begin by understanding why we treat them as such, which requires inquiring and even critiquing our relations with them, which is often not synonymous with our human relations with fellow humans. We should ask why, to begin with, humans farm, hunt, eat, and commercialize animals. This begs for a more socially holistic investigation and not only studying the biology of animals or whether they can feel pain. Essentially, I think Diamond, perhaps under the influence of Elizabeth Anscombe and Ludwig Wittgenstein, first argues to embed animal ethics in human life with animals, such that we move from using thin ethical concepts such as rights, pain, and pleasure to some thick ethical concepts. And second, Diamond argues to stipulate animal ethics with moral psychology, like how we think or recognize animals, which I think also stipulate our treatment of animals. So how would you respond to Cora Diamond? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I mean, I don't really see a clear ethical position in Diamond's article, which of course I know, although I admit I haven't looked at it for quite a few years now. If you ask the question, why do we eat animals? Humans seem to have been eating animals for, perhaps, in fact, given the observations that our closest relatives, chimpanzees, also eat animals occasionally, although they're not predominantly their diet. But Jane Goodall observed them hunting and catching small monkeys. I assume that we have been eating animals since before we were even humans. So I don't really think it's a matter of cultural or social circumstances. I think it's simply that we evolved to satisfy nutritional needs when there wasn't a lot to eat, and particularly, I guess there wasn't a lot of protein sources around to eat. And so those humans who did start to kill and eat animals, or those pre-humans, those great apes or whoever they were, had an evolutionary advantage by eating animals. So, I think that's the fact of the situation, but I don't think it has any real relevance today to our situation because we have so many alternative protein sources that we don't need to eat animals. And it also, of course, the whole way in which we treat animals, as I've been saying, and as Professor Yasol Naval was saying, in factory farms, is completely different from the way our ancestors started to eat animals. So I'm not, it would be pointless anyway, but I'm not going to say that our ancestors were wrong to eat animals. I'm not going to say, in fact, again, to refer to what Professor Yasol Naval said, I'm not going to condemn people living in situations where they cannot feed their families well or cannot get enough protein without hunting and killing animals or fishing, for example. That's not for me to say. But what I am saying is that people who have alternatives, people who buy their food in supermarkets and have a choice of high protein, high quality foods that will nourish them and their families well, and animal products that overwhelmingly come from factory farms, we ought not to be eating animals. And I don't think that what Cora Diamond says really is very relevant to that question today.
All right, thank you very much for that question. Again, very relevant, especially given our context as a developing country, and sometimes, as Professor Yasol Naval has mentioned, it's quite difficult for us to find alternative food sources. So now there's a question raised in our Q&A box. So Joe Mel Cruz, Mr. Joe Mel Cruz, are you here? Would you like to read your question out loud or should I read it for you? Okay, so according to MX Cruz, good day, Professor Singer. Does ethics extend to plant species? Since much of the discussion regarding animal ethics is in regards to their consumption, does that also mean that we have to consider the ethics of the consumption of plants, vegetables, or fruits? So this is, I think, also a bit relevant because there are certain studies concerning the welfare of plants as well and their capacity to feel pain. So what would be your thoughts on this, Professor?
I don't think there are any good studies showing that plants feel pain. This is just a question of fact, but I've looked at this issue. I don't see any evidence that plants feel pain. Yes, there are more complex reactions that are going on in plants than we knew about 20 or 30 years ago. That's true. There are chemical responses to various attacks from pests, for example. But I don't see any evidence of consciousness. They don't have a brain. There's nothing analogous to even the more remote non-human animals. An octopus, for example, is quite remote to us in evolutionary terms. The common ancestor of us and the octopus maybe goes back hundreds of millions of years. But the behavior of the octopus makes it overwhelmingly plausible that they can feel pain, and they do have a brain and actually multiple nerve centers. But there's nothing like that in plants. So I think that is the crucial issue, as Bentham said. The question is not can they reason or can they talk, but can they suffer? And I would say plants cannot suffer. Maybe someday somebody will discover something different, but at the moment, I don't think there's any reason to think that the kind of ethic that I've been defending needs to be extended to plants or to anything else that is not capable of feeling pain.
All right, thank you very much for that clarification, Professor Singer. So you heard it here, folks. As of the moment, there are no studies yet confirming the possibility or the capacity of plants feeling pain. So now let me call on Mr. Carlo Cleto. Mr. Carlo Cleto, he's raising his hand. Please introduce yourself and you are now asked to unmute. Mr. Cleto, are you there? Okay, so it might be the case that Mr. Cleto is having some technical difficulties, but let me read his question out. I'm Carlo, an indigenous vegan from the Ibaloy tribe of the Cordilleras in northern Philippines. I just like to point out that there are a good number of indigenous vegans in the Philippines, like me, who have embraced a vegan life and made this a core part of our liberation struggle, and who have adopted what you might consider a pro-intersectional, pro-poor, pro-approach even in our vegan activism. Please, he's actually plugging here, please check out, among others, the work of Gulay Pamor. As an example, his question is, in the global capitalist neoliberal world order, how can animal rights be accepted in the political and economic mainstream so that the concrete changes we need to see are actually enacted? I think this is a very relevant question, Professor Singer.
It is a very relevant question. Yes, thank you for that question. Perhaps I didn't catch the name of the person who was referred to as the writer who put forward these ideas. Perhaps you could put it in chat so that I can read it. That would be very interesting. But to come to the question, capitalism is responsible for many bad things in the world. That is certainly true. And certainly capitalism has developed immensely technologies for abusing animals, and for the whole factory farming complex has been greatly accelerated by capitalism because of the competitive pressures. But one thing that you can say positively about capitalism is it is responsive to consumers, because if you can't sell your products, you are not going to produce them. Capitalism will not give you a reason for producing products that people don't buy. So I think there is an answer to how, even in a capitalist economy, we can reduce and perhaps eventually eliminate suffering like that of animals in factory farms. And that is if we can persuade people not to buy this product, we can persuade people not to accept it. And we've seen that to some extent in other countries with other products. I mean, in my own lifetime, certainly in Australia where I live, but in many other countries as well, there has really been a huge change in consumption of cigarettes and other tobacco products. Not that they've been eliminated, but they've been dramatically reduced by consumers who've ceased to buy them. Mostly because of their health concerns, but also because they couldn't smoke in the office anymore or in the cinema. They had to go outside to smoke, and they don't like that. So, regulations and restrictions can certainly help, but I think the most important thing is to try to get people to stop buying these products. And that's why I focus on particularly on factory farming. This also, perhaps I'd like to take the chance to respond to something that Professor Yasol Naval said. If local people or indigenous people or people who have trouble feeding their families use animal products, I'm not going to condemn them for doing that. But if we're talking about sustainable agriculture, then factory farming is not a sustainable form of agriculture. And so I think we should encourage people to use animal products if they need to, but to do so in a way that is sustainable and that is not inflicting unnecessary suffering on animals. So in Animal Liberation Now, which you mentioned having got, Professor, I am somewhat more open about saying people who use animal products, if they are conscientious about trying to obtain them in ways that eliminate or at least minimize animal suffering, and if they do not buy products from factory farms, I would regard them as allies in the struggle against factory farms, not as some people in the animal movement might, as in some way just as bad as the factory farmers. I think there's a huge difference between the factory farms and people who raise animals that way or buy those products, and other people who try to minimize the suffering of animals while continuing to eat some animal products.
All right, thank you very much for that, Professor Singer. Now, it's almost 5:23, so maybe we can accommodate two or maybe at most three more questions. And now we will give the floor to Carl, who is raising his hand. I'll be asking you to unmute, Carl, so please introduce yourself.
Hi, Professor Singer. I'm Carl Ramos. I am an MA student, MA philosophy student at the University of the Philippines. So I'd like to say, before I put forward my question, that I really appreciate your lecture. I think it's a very good lecture, and perhaps um, like most of us who attended this conference, online conference, I would like to really embrace your view, your argument, but maybe, maybe like also the majority of us, I also have some, worries
Good. So
about
please ask
the
your question
argument.
because we have a lot
Yeah.
more questions and we need to get through as
All
many
right.
as we can.
Super cool. Okay. So actually have a couple of worries, but I'm going to put forward only one, right? So it seems to me that suffering is central to your equal consideration of similar interstices. Now, the worry that I have comes from contemporary philosophy and science, particularly ethology. So some philosophers like Michael Brady says that suffering involves two things. And we can think of these as conditions. Number one, the capacity to feel bodily pain, bodily and mental pain sensations. And the second condition is enough desire for the pain to stop, right? Now, it seems to be that the majority of non-human animals, for the majority of non-human animals, the first condition can be met, but satisfying the second is highly improbable and may even be naturally impossible. Now,
Sorry, why do you think that animals would not wish the pain to stop?
well, it seems to me that they don't have enough cognitive capacity to have
I
that
don't
kind
think
of
you need
desire.
much cognitive capacity. I mean, if you hurt your dog or cat, if you tread on their paw, they will run away and get out of the way. And there's lots of experiments with giving animals electric shocks, and they run away if they can, or they yelp or scream. I think it's clear that they're trying to stop the pain.
Right, right. I understand. So some animals would react in a way that it would appear as if they want the pain to stop. But some philosophers as well, like Jennifer Corns, would argue that attributing suffering may overinterpret the data. Animals may feel pain, according to her, without anything like the concept of this is bad and I want to stop.
Well, I
And
don't agree with that view, and I think, as I said, there's been a lot of
yeah,
progress in science over the last 50 years, and I think it's all going in the other direction. We are more appreciative of the
and just
capacities and qualities of non-human animals, and their capacity to think, their capacity to reflect. I just had, as was mentioned in the introduction, I do
mhm.
a podcast called Lives Well Lived. We just recorded an interview with a professor at Harvard called Christine Webb, who's published a book called The Arrogant Ape. The interview is not, we haven't released it yet, but it will be in a couple of weeks. And she talks about these ideas that we think that we are so different. And she has lots of studies she refers to that, in my opinion, quite convincingly show that the differences are actually less than we imagine.
Yeah.
Right. Thank
Hi,
you.
Carl. Sorry. Hi, Carl. I think you might have to maybe contextualize perhaps your question more. So I think Paper Professor Singer is more than happy if you can perhaps jot it down first, and maybe we can send in some of the other questions as well, because there are a lot actually. And since we're a bit running out of time, maybe we can have a more comfortable discussion outside of the lecture. Will that be okay?
Yeah, that's totally fine.
Let me,
Thank you.
all right. Thank you so much, Carl. And
Thank you,
now
Professor
we
Singh.
call on, thank you. Now we call on Misha. Misha, are you here? Okay. So, Mish, okay. So, I'm not sure if Misha is here, but um, as a way of um recognition, she is from UP Akay. Okay. So anyway, okay. Maybe we can have instead for our last question, um, Nico Salvador. Nico Salvador, are you here? Okay.
Hi, thank you so much. I'll go straight to my question, but thank you for your lecture. It's really helpful for me because when I was an undergraduate in philosophy, my first paper actually was about your book, and it resonated a lot with me because I've been a vegan for 9 years already. So my question is, um, there's a lot of challenges I encounter being vegan in the Philippines. Um, Often it's the choice between prioritizing economic health, welfare, and capacity of vulnerable populations in the country with that of the welfare of animals. So I've often had to go to immersions or do field works in more impoverished sectors or communities in the country where my being a vegan felt like it was a burden sometimes for the people in those communities to accommodate me. Obviously, for example, they would prepare food, And sometimes they only have access to particular foods like canned fish, or maybe their profession is as fisher folk and things like that. So I've often encountered this burden or this challenge between like, should I accept these what they're offering, or should I try to assert certain boundaries or assert the welfare or my beliefs on the welfare of animals? So I guess my main question really is, how does one balance animal rights and human rights in the context of less developed economies? Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. That's a good question, and it is difficult. And as I've said, and Professor Yassel Naval mentioned it, I regard myself as a flexible vegan, in that, really, to me, it's the consequences that matter, and it's not like a religious thing where if you don't eat meat that is halal or not kosher, you absolutely try to avoid it in all circumstances. But if I can go shopping, as I said, if I can walk into a supermarket and buy my food, it will be vegan. If there are restaurants around that provide vegan options, I will go there. But occasionally, when I'm traveling in some countries, it's really difficult to be purely vegan. It's difficult to, you know, there may be some milk in some product or some cream or some butter that is made. And I don't think it's necessary to be absolutely pure about this, because for this small amount is not really going to make any significant difference. What you want to do is basically try to avoid spending money that will promote, in particular, factory farming, and also set an example of the fact that you can live a healthy life and be active without eating meat or without eating any animal ingredients. But in particular circumstances, I think it's reasonable to make exceptions. And if you were, for example, living with rural people, with fishing people, let's say, and it was important to them that they invite you to a meal, and the only meal that they can provide you with involves fish. I might have some difficulty in eating it, not having eaten fish for many decades, but if you can and if you're comfortable with doing that, I would say don't worry about it too much. This is a different sort of circumstance from the way in which you're living most of your life, where you are vegan. So I would not feel, now I've somehow breached some really important rule, and it'll never be the same again because I've done this. That's not the way I would think about it. I would think about, what are the consequences in these circumstances of me eating something that I would not normally eat, that I would not choose to eat in different circumstances. And if you are convinced that the consequences are such that it's better for you to eat what you're offered, then I would do my best to eat it.
All right, thank you very much for that tip as well. Sorry, is it okay if we accommodate one more question
Sure, let's take
from
one
of
last
our...
question. And maybe let me say, as there are other people who ask questions, on my website, which is petersinger.info, I have now got an AI persona. It's an AI that has been trained on my works. You can click on it down the bottom right-hand corner of my homepage, and you can ask questions to my AI, and it does pretty well, I have to say, in answering them. So feel free to try that if you wanted to ask a question but didn't have time for it. But let's take one last one now.
Thank you so much for that. So please take note of Professor Singer's webpage. Now for our last question, we have Ken Castor from the Department of Philosophy. So he is one of our students here. Ken, are you there? I'll ask you to unmute.
Hello, hello.
Yes,
Hello.
Yes, hello.
Am I audible? Ayan. Thank you. Apologies if I can't open my camera. My laptop's camera is not working. Anyway, my question is, in your book, Practical Ethics, Mr. Singer, you say something about the death of a disabled infant would lead to the birth of another infant with better prospects of a happy life, then more or less the it will be right to kill the disabled infant, no? And a lot of or a number of critics, no, have used this passage and other passages and stances of yours as well, no, as some sort of proof, no, of your alleged ableism, no. Do you also propose that the distinction between the man and animal, if you propose that the distinction between a man and an animal are arbitrary based on your principle of equal interest, no? Does it not run contrary to this view that disabled infant are some sort of I know, are placed sort of lower in the hierarchy of things, you know?
No, it's not. It's not. It's not that I place people with disabilities lower than people without disabilities. But it is my concern to reduce suffering, which of course is very evident in what I was saying about animals. Um, and I would be prepared to kill animals too. In fact, I have killed animals whose lives were going to contain only suffering. Uh, in Australia, we have a problem with rabbits. They are not a native species, but they were introduced by the English colonists, and they cause a lot of problems with eating crops and just environmental damage, eliminating at competing native species. So the government decided to try to get rid of them by spreading a virus called myxomatosis. And this is a virus which kills animals very slowly. The rabbits go blind and then they can't really walk properly. And essentially, they then can't get food and they starve to death or they lie in the hot sun and die. And occasionally, I have been hiking and I have come across a rabbit that clearly had this disease, myxomatosis. And if I have a piece of wood handy, if I can pick up a branch, I will bash that rabbit over the head. I think that's the kindest thing to do to an animal who is suffering. And although that's a very drastic way of killing, of course, if a child is born with severe disabilities and the parents and the doctors in consultation decide that it is not in the interest of the child to continue living, I think they should be able to act on that decision. And in fact, doctors and parents do act on that decision in every major city where there is a hospital for newborn infants. They act on it by turning off the respirator or not putting the baby on a respirator or withholding some other kind of life-sustaining treatment. So they acting on that decision that it's better that the child should not live. But sometimes when you bring about a child's death, deliberately bring about a child's death by withholding treatment, the death may be still somewhat slow and drawn out, and there may be more suffering than would occur if you were to give the baby something that would put the baby to sleep and the baby would die humanely and rapidly. So that's what I'm advocating, that in these particular circumstances, that it should be legal to do that. And in fact, there is one country which has legalized that, and that's the Netherlands. So doctors can do that. But as I said, everywhere doctors can withdraw treatment, and I think that's got the same effect in terms of ending the life of the child. And I think most parents and doctors would think that that was often a better outcome than trying to bring up a child with a disability that will cause a great deal of suffering.
All right, thank you very much, everyone. And of course, thank you very much to our esteemed guest, Professor Singer. That especially, I think, is a question which causes a lot of concern for a lot of us as well. So now I turn over the floor to our host, Professor Zosa and Miss Colleen. Thank you very much.
Again, for all of your questions. And of course, thank you, Professor Singer, for your answers. This meaningful discussion has been very progressive in our understanding of the pressing issue of human to animal ethics, and we hope to carry these insights into our lives moving forward.
And at this time, before we wrap up, we would now like to call on Ms. Mika Gana to give some closing remarks. She is our very own BA Philosophy undergraduate student project head for this lecture. Please join me and happily welcome Ms. Mika Gana to say some final words.
Thank you, Ma'am Zaza. Good afternoon, everyone. As we are about to end this program, allow me to take this time to express my deepest appreciation to everyone who played a role in making today happen. Today has been a very special day, being able to host such an influential philosopher. And I speak on behalf of the UP Diliman Department of Philosophy and expressing gratitude to Professor Singer. Thank you, sir, for being with us here today. Your presence and insights have given us more than just ideas to reflect upon. They have challenged us to re-examine the way we live, the way we think about responsibility, and the way we act in relation to others, not only with humans, but with fellow living beings as well. Philosophy, as we are constantly reminded of, is not only a matter of abstract debate, but also of lived practice, more so of lived practice. We also extend gratitude to the organizers, faculty, students, and every participant who made this event possible. Special thanks as well to our very own Ma'am Jet, Professor Yasol Naval, for the very insightful commentary. As someone who has been in Professor Yasol Naval's class discussing Peter Singer, this is somewhat of a full circle moment for me. Thank you very much again, Professor Singer and Yasol Naval. The discussions we had today will continue to resonate beyond this lecture, and we hope shape the way we engage with the ethical challenges of our time. As we part, let us carry forward what we learned, not just as theoretical knowledge, but as calls to action as well. Thank you all once again.
Thank
Thank
you.
you very
Thanks very
much.
much again to everybody who
Thank you.
organized this. It's been a great experience.
Thank you very much, Professor Peter. And thank you very much, Ms. Mika, for those wonderful words as we prepare to conclude this event. We appreciate your hard work and the overall outcome of this event. Before we end, I first encourage everyone to scan the QR code to be shown on the screen, okay, for the evaluation form, especially for those who will be needing certificates of attendance for this event. Now, let us take a moment to reflect on our discussions today. Our world now finds itself truly at a crossroads, with ethical questions about the relationship between humans and animals at the heart of it. For our guest speakers who have expounded on these questions, I would like to once again thank them deeply for their time in enriching our conversations. I would also like to thank you all, the audience, for attending and engaging in our discussion today. Finally, I would like to thank all the students and faculty involved in the preparation and organization of this event. We hope you are able to bring the lecture's insights with you as you move forward in leading ethically sustainable lives. Thank you, everyone, for making this event a success. We wish you all a pleasant evening, and we hope to see you in our next lectures and events by the UP Diliman Department of Philosophy. So on behalf of my amazing co-host, Colleen, say hi. We thank you, or say goodbye. We thank you and have a great night, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank
Professor
you.
Peter.
Thank you, Professor
Thank you.
Singer.
Prof. Jet, thank
Bye.
you.
Thank
Professor
you. Thank you.
Singer.
You.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. We'll get in touch, Professor
Okay.
Singer. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, thanks for attending, everyone. We'll be closing the Zoom room in a few seconds. Thank you again for coming, and we hope to see you in our future events.
Congratulations.
Thank you po, Ma'am Jet. Thank you po sa lahat.
Asiya, congratulations